Hey guys, I'm doing my presentation on term sheets and contracts. Super exciting stuff. So I just thought I'd start out, let you guys know like just kind of what it is basically. And it's just kind of a document. This document gets used a lot with like startups and companies who are just beginning and they need investment or capital. And it's kind of just like a document that has a whole lot of guidelines for how they're going to be how the investment is going to be made. It's like really important in tracking investors too. So I think Shark Tank a lot when I was doing research on this project. A lot of the things been reminding me of that. But going right into like some of the things that are on it, the actual like the important aspects of the sheet. I think the three like kind of more important things are how much they're going to put or how much the company is worth, the amount of the investment that they're going to put in, and then the percentage of the stake that they're going to get. I think that's kind of like a good general like overview of the stock. That's the Shark Tank I reference I kind of thought of. It's like, I'll pay you however much money to get however much percentage of your company, which is worth however much. And like all those are kind of the beginning things you'll put on a term sheet. Continuing, there's some other things that I know that other people are doing some presentations on, so I don't want to get too much into them. But the voting rights or how like the choices are going to be made with like the board or with other people. The liquidation preferences, which will happen upon liquidation or bankruptcy, like who gets what money first, things like that, and then other like provisions and things like this. So for this is just a quick example to explain liquidation preferences to you guys. So I don't know if this is in the way, but it's like assuming that just a normal Series A like standard investment, they own 20%, and later on through whatever series of events they liquidate for $40 million. Some common liquidation preferences would be non-participating or participating, and then with or without a cap. If you're using if you're just using kind of basic preferences. One times non-participating would mean that you would just receive your preference, which is them owning 20%, and how much it was sold for was $40 million, which would be $8 million. If there's a cap on it, then normally they'll be participating, or it doesn't have to be, but I guess a one-time participating investment, you would get your preference first, and then after that you get 20% of whatever's left up until the cap of 2 times your investment. So for this, they can only get a total of $10 million, even though the cap would be higher. And then you can also get a participating cap without a cap. So that means your money would not be limited at all. You would just receive all of it in all of its entirety. Anti-dilutive provisions. I don't want to go into this too much too, because I know somebody else has a presentation on it, but these are basically like the no's, like the vetoes, the negatives. It's like investors will put this all on a list, and it's things that the company can't do without the investor's permission. Basically, like another way for them to increase the amount of control that they're going to have in like the actual process for the company. These are things that investors are definitely going to be looking into when they're like doing their due diligence, and they're trying to figure out like what they like, who they want to work with, because some companies will try to keep too much control, or some investors will try to take too much control. One thing that I did find pretty interesting about term sheets is that they're mostly, for the most part, they're non-binding. Sometimes companies and investors will go through multiple rounds of this, Series A, Series B, Series C, sometimes what they're called. But the actual contents can be changed, and they're not legally binding except for a couple of portions. I have some pictures later on, and I'll show you guys an actual term sheet, but just for the example, non-disclosure and exclusivity, those things are legally binding, and it's so investors can't, go around and just look at a bunch of different deals, and then right at the end when they think they have the best one, quit all the other ones that they were involved in. I think it just increases the amount of fairness that is, I don't know, it just keeps it fair between companies, in my opinion. But and then after I figured out that these weren't like legally binding for the most part, other than those two like kind of important options, I was thinking, why are they so important? But I guess that the fact that they lay all the groundwork between these two parties before you even have to incur any legal charges, or before you have to get into any actual legal obligations with these people. You can see what they actually want, what their plans are for the future, what everybody is going to do, and like you have to set what your part will be entirely before you get into business with somebody. And I think that the term sheet really helps out with that. So I think that's definitely important. As for what investors are actually looking for on a term sheet, like I was saying before, some of those veto rights and some of those veto rights and things that are trying to take too much control are definitely turnoffs for investors. If they and as well as like harsh debt and convertible note terms. But convertible notes are also I'm also going to go into a little bit later. But anything that will limit your fundraising or pretty much anything that they just don't like because it's their investment and their money, they can completely shut down the entire process for, basically. For convertible notes, I did not know really what convertible notes were before I did this, and I had to look it up. But it's basically debt, but it will convert into stock only upon very like specific events. So as for like why you would use those, I was thinking I looked up when they were generally used, which is around smaller investors, I guess $500,000, while usually preferred stocks just used when it gets to like bigger amounts of millions, 750,000, things like that. But it does cost less to like cost, and it's faster and it's more simple to use convertible notes. So I think that's why that's definitely why a lot of companies choose to do it, or startups do. And then over here I have, I'm just going to go through a couple, this is a picture of an actual standard Series A term sheet that I broke up into a couple pieces just to go through a couple of the components that I thought was interesting. This one, as you can see that it just opens up and it says like the three things or that I kind of think are important. You have your company, you have your investment amount, and your valuations. So they'll just kind of everything that everybody was talking about, how much they're going to pay and how much they're going to get. I think it's just a really important thing to put up front, get it all out of the way, as well as the liquidation preferences. Like I was talking about before, this one's a one-time non-participating preference. And so that would mean that they would just get their preference back upon liquidity if a company went bankrupt, if they could. And then conversions and dividends are also involved on these. But also when I'm talking about, or when talking about a term sheet, these things can all be, they can be different depending on the company. Like sometimes they'll have more, sometimes they'll have less, not for the standard Series A, but sometimes they'll have more things than the other rights, sometimes they'll have less, depending on their situation. A couple of things I found interesting on this portion of the sheet was a drag along, or drag alongs are certain specific things that or certain like company sales that can be pulled through regardless of what a shareholder wants, even if they can normally have a veto right or something like that. A drag along would overturn that. And then in other rights, they also have things such as the right of first refusal and co-sale rights, which will try to protect you when upon sales by founders. Things like that will try to protect your money and protect your shares. Oh, as for the board as well, I think this one's kind of important too, because how many decisions later on down the road that the board will be making. So it'll tell you how many or who gets to designate who as directors. And then lastly on this, we got the founder and employee vesting. I thought it was a little interesting, and that's basically what happens upon a change of control. So like if the founder was to not be there anymore or things like that. And then at the very end, they'll just throw in the only thing in this entire term sheet that is legally binding, which is the no shop. And the no shop is that exclusivity portion I was talking about. And then they sign, the company signs, and then the lead investor signs. And that's like pretty much everybody, or that's pretty much like everything that'll go down to standard Series A. We'll get all that down, and then everybody will go look at it, think about what they want to change, and then maybe go to a standard Series B. In conclusion, it's just this sheet is. I thought it was kind of interesting how it's really important for the beginning of this process, and probably like a little bit later on as well. And it'll like give you a lot of guidelines in your agreements, but at the same time, there's no real legal weight to it, other than you can't be jumping around looking at multiple at the same time. So, but that was pretty much all I really had about this. If you guys have any questions, definitely love to answer any of them.
Damien, we'll let Katie moderate the Q&A. So Katie, go ahead and begin for us, please.
Yeah, thank you, Damien. That was an awesome presentation. Does anybody have any questions or anything to start us off with? If not, I actually have a question. So the term sheet essentially is like a non-binding agreement, which you said that lays the groundwork. So what would be the next step for a company if they wanted something that was legally binding? Would that just be essentially a contract, or what would be the next step?
Yeah, exactly. So my project was term sheets and contracts. I didn't really go into contracts that much because I think they'd be really similar, except for the contract is legally binding and they go through a lot more specifications. They get everything down that anybody had any questions about. But yeah, they'll go through a couple different rounds of term sheets to make sure they get it right before doing anything legally.
Okay, so it's essentially kind of like a draft in a way.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a draft, but also practice almost. You can see what the other company or what the other group is thinking. Maybe get in their head a little bit. I think that's one of
it. Okay, awesome. Does anybody else have any questions for Damien?
So Damien, I'll ask you to kind of, in a nutshell, like in a couple of sentences, tell us what a term sheet is.
All right. If I had to cut it down, I would say when a company is being invested in, the document stating the basic guidelines for behavior and action upon so I don't know what the word I'm looking for. And action upon actual investment, and the document that holds those, that's the term sheet. It's the practice, the run through, but also it's the first, second, third step leading towards an actual a real step.
So how is that different from what we colloquially consider a gentleman's agreement?
It is not, except we write it down, I'd say. All right. Actually, the gentleman's agreement, I'd say maybe even holds more weight than this does, because any time that somebody can pull out of a term sheet, you can't be going around doing more than one at the same time. I think that's what the no shop says before, but correct me if I'm wrong, of course. But other than that, the only thing on there, there's nothing else on there that is really legally required. I guess a gentleman's agreement, just my word. If I say I was going to do something, there's nothing physically requiring me to do it other than my word. But I mean, I guess it just depends on how you think about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Jens, I'm going to guess that you've seen a couple of term sheets, and I've certainly seen a bunch of them. Have any of the rest of you ever seen or experienced a term sheet?
Never.
Skylar, so come off of mute for a moment. What would you tell us about a term sheet that hasn't already been referenced?
I don't know if we touched on it a whole lot. Was kind of it was referenced, but I think the important part was just the percent ownership based off of convertible debt and things like that. That was kind of the big thing. At least in 495, we talked about a lot, was just how that looks for a company and what situations are better than others.
Okay. And Katie, I'm going to guess you've looked at these some in anticipation of being to discuss it here. What else would you add to Damien's comments?
I looked at them a little bit, and Damien kind of went over what I would say. It's just a non-buying agreement that kind of lays the foundation for a company before they actually enter into a legal agreement.
Okay. Jens, what would you have to offer to this? And I've got a couple of things that might be relevant here as well.
Yeah, I've seen quite a few term sheets, and they're, in my opinion, and you can weigh in on this, Rick, I think they're very useful when you're entering into a negotiation, because it kind of sets the frame and of course terms. It's called a term sheet for ownership and claims throughout the process. And of course, you do the negotiations on the back of it before you sign a deal, but that really dictates where you start off.
Yeah, so think about it this way, guys. Normally, when one of these is being negotiated, when there's a consideration of acquiring a firm, which remember, a firm is simply an asset. It just happens to be typically a relatively complex asset, right? And the ownership of the firm is far more complex than most investors would ever even think about. And you guys have been getting a sense of that in the years that you've been studying finance. So think about this. There's not usually just one person representing a buyer and one person representing a seller. Normally, there are teams of people on both sides of this. And you're either sitting in a conference room as you discuss some of these, or you're on a Zoom and you've got a half a dozen phone calls going back and forth, and you've got the attorneys and the accountants and the senior vice president of whatever weighing in, and you've got the bankers and all these different people. And so you can appreciate that keeping track of the details of what has been agreed to or not can be relatively complex. And so a term sheet's purpose is to kind of keep track of all of that. And at the point where you're wrapping up a session, if you will, then you recreate, or for the first time create a term sheet that says, okay, we have thus far agreed on these things, and this non-disclosure, of course, and no shop, that may be binding, but the rest of it are just things we've agreed on so far. So when we pick up our discussion on Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, we know where we left off. Are there elements that can't be included in a term sheet? Damien, what do you think? Are there things that we can't throw into a term sheet? If you and I are, and our teams are negotiating about Veda Incorporated, are there elements that can't be included in our term sheet?
I can't really think of anything. I don't see why you can't go through the entire deal, I guess.
Yeah, in fact, and this is something you might want to consider for contracts in general. Yeah. Contracts are a blank slate when you begin with them. Term sheets are a blank slate. And virtually anything and everything with respect to the deal you're considering can go there, as long as A, they are not illegal, and B, you're not allowed to contract away constitutionally guaranteed rights. Okay. Otherwise, anything and everything goes. I've seen term sheets where there literally was a requirement that before the deal closed, that the executive bathroom was split into 2 rooms, so there was a male and a female version of it. I've seen term sheets that stated that the boat that's owned by the company must go to the new owner. It's not allowed to be kept by the existing owner. I've seen term sheets that laid out 7 classes of common stock. I mean, I'm talking about the esoterics, right, and the things that are just way out there. But virtually anything goes as long as it's not illegal, and as long as we haven't attempted to negotiate away our constitutionally guaranteed rights. Remember that contracts are simply agreements, and agreements start with you and I saying we agree, but when there's more than just you and me, and when it gets complex, it's a great idea to write it down, and the more detailed it is, more complex it is, the longer it's going to be and the more tenants there will be in it. Any other comments with respect to term sheets or structured contracts?
I have a question, if I may.
Please.
How long does it take to get the term sheet? Like after it's signed, or?
You get the term sheet isn't like go through the process of finishing one, because I mean, I guess it's just up to how the parties are. I'm sure some people could come together and finish one in a day. Others,
yeah, I mean,
a week.
Does it do you have to have some lawyers go over the term sheet and stuff after you have, or before you signed it, and after?
Since it's not legally binding, I don't think you have to. You could if you wanted to, but it's more like what Rick said. It's to write down the agreements, the things that you guys have agreed on, and kind of hold them in place. I think more than actually to cover yourself for the future. Like I think you'll probably have a lot of lawyers look at it before you take stuff to the actual contract, but I don't think it's necessary. It's not legally
So you will get like the term sheet pretty fast after signing the term sheet.
Well, that'd be a nice idea, Henriette. And
Gotcha.
we might agree that there may not always be a good reason not to get it quickly, but whenever you have that many people involved in a negotiation, and then it goes to lawyers, and then it goes to the lawyers to make sure the lawyers do what the lawyers are supposed to do. And it sounds like I'm being ridiculous, and I'm not. I'm just kind of telling you the truth as to how these things work sometimes. They can take time. But there's no statute. There's no standard X number of days. It's not like a real estate contract or a consumer protected contract where you have X days before it goes binding, unless you've stated, here it is May 27th, and this term sheet, as long as it's not disagreed with, by the end of the 5th day, it goes binding as a full contract. You could put that into them, but they're just a blank slate to start with, and then you make decisions, and then you argue about them. I have a brother that will tell you that these kinds of documents are simply the foundation for the arguments our lawyers are going to have and the bills we're going to get from the lawyers.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Well, the next step is the contract, of course. And the contract simply picks up where the term sheet leaves off. It just formalizes things in such a way that all the lawyers are happy about the I's having been dotted and the T's crossed, and the language being either open enough to leave future interpretation or tight enough to leave out any interpretation. It might surprise you, but sometimes you will negotiate contracts and you'll leave the language vague enough to leave the door open for interpretation. And that may seem counterproductive. And in fact, it very often is counterproductive, but it's often a strategy that's employed, including in term sheets. Okay, well, Damien, thank you.